As for how common it is that those charged with a violent offense or a gun-related offense are released pre-trial, they make up about 72% of the current electronic monitoring population. Those are those ankle bracelets. 3% of them are accused of murder. And for comparison, back in 2016, that first number was around 20%, with less than 1% charged with murder. All right, so joining me now to dive deeper into this conversation, we have Jody D. Who's a professor of law at USC. And we also have Dr. Laura McNeal, BNC Chief Legal Correspondent, with us today. I want to thank you both. Mr. D. we normally do ladies first here. So we'll go to Dr. Laura. And Dr. Laura, many people say stay in the system before they're even able to go to trial because they're unable to post bail. How does this impact communities that look like you and I?
Yes, unfortunately, Tashanea, it has a significant impact on communities of color because we tend to have a higher level of people living in poverty from low socioeconomic households. And if you can imagine what it's like to have the primary breadwinner in your home put in jail because they can't post a $500 bail, they lose their jobs, and that has devastating impact on Black and brown families. And so unfortunately, even as we speak, at a given time, there are 700,000 people sitting in jail simply because they cannot post cash bail. And keep in mind, these are typically misdemeanors and nonviolent offenses.
And Professor Armour, can you talk about communities that actually strive off of having these high bails for Black and brown folks, and that's actually how they fund some of their community structures?
Oh yeah, the misdemeanors we saw when the Department of Justice went out to Ferguson and looked at how they were turning the Black community into an ATM machine for funding municipal functions of all kinds. What we're talking about in a lot of these cases are misdemeanors, people being drawn in for misdemeanors, and a lot of funds being taken out of their pockets and directed elsewhere, and it impoverishes the community to run them through a lot of the kind of bail system problems that they run into in the current system.
Yeah, and not only they're already impoverished, so they're just digging a deeper hole trying to come out, robbing Peter to pay Paul, as the saying goes. Dr. Laura, people with low-level offenses are in jail longer, while people who committed more violent crimes are sometimes on electric monitoring bracelets. I remember that story you mentioned about the two women, one white, one Black, similar offenses. But the Black woman got, I believe it was 18 months behind bars, and the white woman got bail. Why such an imbalance?
Well, the reality is there are sentencing guidelines in place to prevent these types of imbalances. The idea is that you don't want to have wide differences in how people are sentenced for the exact same crimes. But a part of that, too, is judges are given a great deal of discretion in how they work within that sentencing guideline ratio. So if they say, based on this crime, they should get 20 to 30 years, well, a lot of times, unfortunately, bias creeps in, implicit and explicit racial bias. And what we'll see is that defendants of color, time and time again, are sentenced to much harsher sentences as opposed to their white counterparts. And that's the story that you were referencing that happened in Ohio a little while ago. And so unfortunately, I think we need to give judges less discretionary room in terms of how those sentencing guidelines are interpreted.
Well, Professor, then the question's for you. How do we do that?
Well, one of the things we have to be careful of is not to move away from cash bail toward another system that involves algorithms that have into them baked bias. And so that's a problem we ran into out here in California. There was a push to eliminate cash bail, but the replacement was going to be a set of formulas that many activists recognized would also disproportionately keep Black folks and poor folks behind bars before their trial. So we have to just be very careful, recognize that this is a moment that law enforcement has been shown once again to be purveying fake news. They've been fear-mongering. They've been saying that bail reform actually makes us less safe, and the data is unambiguous and very clear on this. That's not true. And so It used to be the law enforcement would find an anecdote, an outlier, and point to it and say, oh, here's somebody who got out on bail reform and they went out and did a horrible thing. It shows you that bail reform is bad and it leads to a spike in violence. But thanks to these studies, we're able to get beyond the anecdote and the outliers and say, yeah, there's going to be some of that happens occasionally. Tragically, it's unavoidable. But overall, there's no spike in violence. So if we look at things in the aggregate, we're not going to let your fear-mongering drive our policy anymore. And they've been very effective. I think that's what we saw in the show, the story you just showed us from CNN, that the reporters are no longer just being stenographers for law enforcement. They're stepping in and looking at the empirical claims and showing that they really don't have as much behind them as law enforcement would have you believe. And therefore, maybe what we should really be criticizing at this moment of increased violence is the status quo. Why does law enforcement, with all this money, why are they unable to keep the crime rates low? It looks like maybe we need some other interventions in law enforcement. They want to distract from that and talk about bail reform rather than the failed status quo.
And Dr. Laura, final word.
No, I think what's most important, we need to continue the state legislation and hopefully eventually get some federal bail reform. I think that's the key to ensuring that regardless of what state you're in, that you have the protections, that you're not being unfairly targeted simply because you're poor.
Absolutely, with those racist algorithms, which we've reported on, and Professor Moore, you also mentioned. I want to thank you both for joining us this afternoon for this conversation. It's very insightful.